A marshal lies dead, his blood soaking into the floorboards of his own office. The whole town knows who pulled the trigger, but no one dares speak his name. Until 2 years later, when his niece rides into Red Hollow carrying his badge and a letter that names his killer. This is the story of a woman who came for justice and found something far more dangerous, the truth. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories of betrayal, revenge, and redemption in the Old West, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from right now. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's ride into Red Hollow. The oil lamp burned low in the marshal's office. Its flame bent and twisted each time the night wind slipped through cracks in the weathered wood. Shadows stretched long across the walls of Red Hollow's law office, dancing like specters over wanted posters that curled at their edges. The town slept uneasily beyond those thin walls as it had for months, wrapped in a silence that felt more like surrender than peace. Daniel Reed sat at his desk, his weathered hands moving across paper with deliberate care. At 50 years old, his face carried the map of a hard life lived honorably. Deep lines traced from the corners of eyes that had seen too much, a jaw that remained firm despite the tremor that sometimes visited his fingers. Tonight, that tremor was worse. He pressed harder, with the pen willing his hand to steady. The letter he wrote would be his last testament. He knew this with the certainty that comes not from prophecy, but from pattern. The footsteps he'd been hearing behind him for weeks. The whispered conversations that died when he entered rooms. The way old friends no longer met his eyes. Red Hollow had been dying slowly for years, strangled by fear, dressed in expensive suits and false smiles. Daniel had tried to save it. Tonight he would learn if trying was enough. Sarah, he wrote the name alone, causing his chest to tighten. His niece, the daughter he'd never had, the marshal he'd trained to be better than he ever was. If you're reading this, I'm dead. Victor Stone killed me. Not with his own hands, perhaps, but with his choices, his greed, his willingness to destroy anyone who threatened his empire. The mind transfer is forged. Thomas Pike created it. Find the truth. Restore what was stolen, and tell Grace her father loved her more than life itself. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Not hurried, not hesitant, measured and purposeful, like a man walking to a grave he'd already dug. Daniel's hand moved to his revolver, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. Some confrontations couldn't be avoided with steel. Some required facing the truth you'd been running from. He slid the letter into a hidden compartment beneath the desk's bottom drawer. A place Sarah would find if she looked, if she cared to search, if she came back to this godforsaken town at all. His hand lingered on the wood for a moment, as if the desk itself could absorb his final message, hold it safe until the right person asked the right questions. The knock on the door came soft, almost polite. That made it worse somehow. "It's opened by him," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the ice forming in his gut. The door swung inward. A man stepped through, silhouetted by moonlight from the street. For a moment, he was just a shape, faceless and anonymous. Then he moved into the lamplight, and Daniel felt the last piece of his heart break clean in two. Victor. The name came out as both greeting and accusation. "You shouldn't have come here." Victor Stone had aged in the 15 years since they'd first pinned on badges together. His hair had gone silver at the temples, his shoulders had broadened with prosperity, his hands had softened from lack of honest work. But his eyes remained the same eyes that had once watched Daniel's back in a dozen gunfights, that had shared whiskey after burying good men, that had sworn an oath to uphold justice no matter the cost. Those eyes were hollow now, empty rooms where conviction used to live. 15 years, Daniel. Victor's voice carried the weight of graves. 15 years we wore the badge together, bled together. I taught you how to read a man's eyes before his gun cleared leather. You taught me that mercy wasn't weakness. I remember. Daniel stood slowly, not reaching for his gun. Not yet. I also remember the oath we took. To protect and serve. To uphold the law even when it costs us everything. The law. Victor laughed, a sound like breaking glass. The law doesn't feed hungry children. Didn't pay for medicine when my daughter was dying. Remember that, Daniel. Remember when I begged you to look the other way just until Emily's surgery was paid for. But you couldn't, could you? You and your goddamn principles. You weren't just skimming to save Emily. Daniel's words fell like stones into still water. You built an empire on the backs of men too scared to say no. You turned protection into extortion. You made Red Hollow afraid to breathe. I made Red Hollow functional. The words exploded from Victor, raw and desperate. You think those miners care about moral purity when they have roofs that don't leak. You think shopkeepers lose sleep over where the money comes from as long as their families are safe. Safe from what? From you. Daniel took a step forward. Victor, it's not too late. We can fix this. Together. Like we used to. For a moment, something flickered in Victor's eyes. Something that might have been the man he used to be struggling against the man he'd become. His hand trembled at his side, fingers twitching toward the gun at his hip, then falling away. He looked at Daniel the way a drowning man looks at shore just before the current takes him under. I came here to give you one last chance, Victor whispered. Walk away. Tonight. Tell them you're retiring. Tell them you're tired. Tell them anything you want. Just walk away and let me keep what I've built. You know I can't do that. Then you're a fool. Victor's hand moved to his gun. Not fast, not with the practiced efficiency of a gunfighter. Slow and inevitable, like watching a man fall from a great height. Grace needs to know the truth, Victor. She needs to know what kind of man her father really is. Victor froze, his hand hovered over his holster, trembling. You wouldn't. You promised me you'd never tell her. That secret was supposed to stay buried. Secrets have a way of clawing back to the surface, especially ones soaked in blood. The shot shattered the night silence. A single crack that echoed off storefronts and died in the desert beyond. Daniel staggered backward, his hand clutching at his chest, where red bloomed across his shirt like a dark flower. He reached toward the desk, fingers grasping for something, anything to hold on to, as his legs gave way. Victor stood frozen, the smoking gun hanging from his hand like a weight he couldn't put down. Tears carved tracks through the dust on his weathered face. His lips moved, forming words that couldn't change what had already happened. I'm sorry. God help me, Daniel. I'm so sorry. Daniel Reed fell. His blood spread across the wooden floor, soaking into the grain, staining the planks where justice had stood for 15 years. His eyes stayed open, staring at the ceiling, at shadows that danced in lamplight, at nothing at all. His hands still reached toward the desk, toward the hidden letter, toward a niece who would one day need to know the truth. Victor stood over his oldest friend's body for a long moment. Then he turned and walked into the darkness, leaving behind the hollow shell of the man he used to be, and the corpse of the only person who'd ever believed he could be better. The lamp burned on through the night, its oil slowly running dry, its light growing dimmer with each passing hour. By dawn, when the town woke to find their marshal dead, the flame had guttered it out entirely. Red Hollow had lost its light, and Victor Stone had ensured it would stay dark for years to come. 2 years passed. The desert didn't notice. Time moved differently in Arizona territory, measured not in seasons, but in dust storms and dry spells, in the slow erosion of hope, and the gradual acceptance of fear. Red Hollow learned to live with its ghosts. Daniel Reed's name became something whispered, then spoken, less than forgotten by anyone who hadn't known him personally. His office stood empty, locked, gathering cobwebs and memories. But some ghosts refused to stay buried. Sarah Hart rode into Red Hollow on a horse the color of smoke. The afternoon sun hung overhead like a judgment, turning the main street into a river of pale dust and hard light. She didn't announce herself, didn't need to. The way she sat her saddle, the way her coat hung open, just enough to show the gun at her hip, the way her eyes took in every detail with the practiced assessment of someone who'd learned to spot trouble before it spotted her, all of it spoke louder than any introduction. She was 33 years old and looked both younger and older, depending on the light. Younger in her movements, which carried an easy grace that came from confidence rather than youth. Older in her eyes, which had seen the worst things people could do to each other and kept looking anyway. Her dark hair was pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat. Her hands rested easy on the reins, but there was nothing easy about the readiness in her posture. A boy ran out from the livery stable, maybe 10 years old, with dirt on his face and excitement in his eyes. He skidded to a stop when he got close enough to see Sarah, clearly suddenly aware that running at strangers with guns wasn't the smartest thing a child could do. He recovered his manners quickly. "Your horse need water, ma'am." His voice cracked on the question. Sarah dismounted in one smooth motion. Appreciate it. You know the way to the cemetery. The question seemed to hit the boy like a physical thing. His eyes went wide, then wary, then something else. Something that looked like recognition mixed with fear. You asking about someone specific? Daniel Reed. The boy took a half step backward. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. You're, you're Miss Sarah. Now it was Sarah's turn to pause. She studied the boy's face, looking for the trap in the question, the hidden meaning, the danger she'd learned to expect in moments like this. How do you know my name? Marshall Reed talked about you all the time, said you were the best deputy he ever trained, said you'd come back someday to finish what he started. The words tumbled out in a rush like water breaking through a dam. He said you were his niece, his family, the only person he trusted to do what needed doing. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. She hadn't cried in years, wouldn't cry now. But the ache was there, sharp and immediate, like pressing on a bruise that had never fully healed. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a worn leather pouch. From it, she withdrew a badge, tarnished silver with the initials DR scratched into its surface. He ever mentioned this? The boy's eyes locked onto the badge like it was something holy. He wore that every day, said it was the most important thing he owned because it reminded him who he was supposed to be. He sent it to me 2 weeks before he died, along with a letter. But I was deep undercover in Colorado. The letter sat at a dead drop for 18 months before I could retrieve it. By then, Daniel was long buried. The letter told me what I needed to know, and that I'd know what to do. Do you? The boy's question was simple, direct. Know what to do, so Sarah looked past him down the main street of Red Hollow. She saw buildings that needed paint, windows that needed cleaning, people who moved with the careful wariness of animals in predator territory. She saw a town that had learned to keep its head down and its mouth shut. A town that had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. I'm starting to figure it out, she said quietly. Cemeteries, which direction? The boy pointed. East side of town. But ma'am, you should know, folks here, they don't much like talking about Marshall Reed. Not because they didn't love him, because they did. And because remembering him hurts too much. The things that hurt are usually the ones we need to remember most. Sarah led her horse down the street, following the boy's directions. Behind her, she heard doors closing, saw curtains twitch in windows, felt the weight of watching eyes. Red Hollow knew a reckoning had arrived. It just didn't know yet whether that reckoning would save it or bury it deeper. The cemetery sat on a small rise east of town, where the desert stretched endlessly toward mountains that looked like broken teeth against the sky. Wooden markers stood at odd angles, weathered by wind and time. A few had stones carved with names and dates by those who could afford permanence. Most just had crosses, simple and anonymous, marking the passage of lives too poor or too forgotten to merit more. Daniel Reed's grave had a stone. Someone had cared enough to commission one to have his name carved deep enough that the desert couldn't erase it quickly. The inscription was simple. Daniel Reed, Marshall, father, friend. Nothing about how he died. Nothing about justice or sacrifice. Just the bare facts of a life that had mattered to someone. Sarah stood before the grave for a long time, hat in hand, feeling the afternoon sun beat down on her bare head. She didn't pray, wasn't sure she remembered how, but she talked voice-low words meant only for the man beneath the stone and whatever part of him might still be listening. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner, Daniel. I was working in Colorado when your letter reached me. Finished the job there. Took me a month to wrap things up and ride here. I know that's not an excuse. I know you taught me better. But I'm here now, and I'm going to finish what you started. I don't know exactly what that is yet, but I'll figure it out. You taught me how to see the truth even when everyone around me is lying. You taught me how to stand when standing seems impossible. I won't let those lessons go to waste. He would have appreciated hearing that. The voice came from behind her, soft and carrying a sadness so deep it had become part of the speaker's bones. Sarah's hand went to her gun before her mind caught up with her reflexes. She turned slowly, hand still hovering near her holster, and found a woman standing there with a bouquet of wildflowers clutched in weathered hands. Emma Walsh looked like she'd been beautiful once before time, and heartbreak had carved channels in her face. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, with hair that might have been blonde, before gray started claiming territory. Her dress was practical, the kind worn by women who work for their living. Her eyes were the saddest Sarah had ever seen. "You're Sarah," Emma said. Not a question. "You look like he said you would, strong, careful, ready for the worst." "And you are Emma Walsh. I own the Dustfall Saloon. I was also—" She paused, searching for words that could capture something too complicated for simple labels. "I love Daniel. He knew. He felt the same, I think. But he never said it out loud. Never let himself have anything good. Not while this town was bleeding." Sarah studied her, seeing past the worn dress and sad eyes to something harder underneath. Emma Walsh was a survivor. The kind of woman who'd learned to live in a world that didn't much care whether she lived or died. That gave them something in common. "He never mentioned you, not in any of his letters. That was Daniel's way, keeping things separate, keeping people safe by keeping them distant." Emma moved forward, kneeling to place the flowers on the grave. Her hands shook slightly. "He talked about you, though, said you were the best thing he'd ever done. Training you, teaching you that justice meant something more than just following rules. He was proud of you, even when you left. Especially then, I think. He knew you needed to find your own way." The words landed heavier than Sarah expected. She'd left Red Hollow 8 years ago, fresh with her deputy badge, and burning with the need to prove herself somewhere Daniel's reputation wouldn't overshadow her own. She'd told herself he understood, had convinced herself that their occasional letters were enough to maintain the connection. Now standing at his grave, she wondered if she'd been lying to herself about that too. "You came back for a reason," Emma said, standing dusting dirt from her knees. "Not just to pay respects. Daniel wouldn't have wanted that. He'd have wanted action." Sarah reached into her coat and pulled out the letter Daniel had sent. The paper was creased from being folded and unfolded dozens of times, the ink slightly smeared from the oils in her fingers. She didn't need to read it. Every word was burned into her memory. But she handed it to Emma anyway, watched her eyes move across Daniel's final written words. Emma's hands trembled harder as she read. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and returned it, her eyes wet with tears she refused to let fall. "He knew, at the end he knew what was coming, and he called for you anyway. The letter names Victor directly, says he killed Daniel, says Thomas Pike forged the documents. But I need more than accusations from a dead man. I need proof, witnesses, evidence that will hold up when Victor's lawyers try to tear it apart. You want the truth." Emma's voice hardened. "The official story is Daniel interrupted a burglary, shot by persons unknown. Case closed within a week. No suspects. No investigation worth the name. And the real story is that 4 men died that same night, all of them witnesses to things Victor Stone didn't want witnessed. All of them ruled accidents or suicides or random violence. All of them silenced before they could speak to anyone who mattered." Emma's eyes met Sarah's, and in them Sarah saw a rage that had been banked low for 2 years, waiting for someone to give it oxygen. "Your uncle was murdered because he wouldn't stop asking questions, because he wouldn't let Victor Stone turn Red Hollow into his personal kingdom, and because nobody else in this town had the spine to stand with him." The name landed like a stone. Victor Stone. "You know him?" "Ian knew him 15 years ago. He and Daniel rode together, wore the badge together." Sarah's mind raced backwards, sorting through memories, looking for the moment when things had changed. Victor saved Daniel's life twice. Daniel trusted him like a brother. Trust is a luxury in Red Hollow, has been for years. Emma gestured back toward town. "Come with me. There's someone you need to meet, someone Daniel took in, someone who needs to know you're here." They walked back through town together, 2 women who'd loved the same man in different ways, bound now by grief and the terrible weight of unfinished business. The sun angled lower, throwing long shadows across storefronts that looked like they were holding their breath. Emma led Sarah to the Dustfall Saloon, a 2-story building with fresh paint that couldn't quite hide the cracks underneath. Inside, the saloon was cleaner than Sarah expected. Not fancy, but maintained with care. The bar was polished, the floor was swept. The bottles behind the counter stood in neat rows like soldiers at attention. A few early drinkers sat at tables nursing whiskey and keeping their voices low. They all looked up when Sarah entered, then quickly looked away when they saw the gun at her hip and the badge she still carried in her hand. A girl stood behind the bar, wiping glasses with methodical precision. She was 16, maybe 17, with blonde hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her eyes were startlingly blue, intelligent, wary. She looked up when Emma and Sarah approached, and something flickered across her young face. Recognition, maybe, or hope, or fear, maybe all three. Grace, Emma said gently. This is Marshall Sarah Hart, Daniel's niece. The girl Grace set down the glass she'd been cleaning. Her hands moved to her apron fingers, twisting the fabric. You came. You knew I would. He said you would, near the end, when things got bad. He said Sarah would come back, said you'd finish what he started. Grace's voice carried that peculiar mixture of hope and resentment that only comes from being too young to understand why adults make the choices they do. You're late. The accusation hung in the air. Sarah didn't deny it, couldn't deny it. I came as fast as I could, soon as I got his letter. He sent that letter 6 weeks before he died. Where were you tonight? Colorado, working a case. No telegraph lines where I was. The letter waited 18 months for me to surface from undercover work. Then it took me another 2 months to wrap up and ride here. I know that's not an excuse. I know you taught me better. But I'm here now. Grace studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Some of the tension went out of her shoulders. He talked about you, said you were like him, said you couldn't walk away from what was wrong even when walking away would be smarter. He said that was a good thing. He said it was a necessary thing, different from good. Grace poured water into 3 glasses, set them on the bar. You should know before we go further. Before you start asking questions and digging into things, people want to stay buried. This town, it's not what it was. People here, they're scared. And scared people do desperate things. Scared of what or scared of who? Emma and Grace exchanged a look. Some unspoken communication passed between them, the kind that comes from living through hard times together. Finally, Grace spoke. Victor Stone owns half this town, literally owns it. He has deeds, legal documents, papers that say he's the rightful owner of the mine, most of the businesses, even some of the houses. He has men who enforce his rules. He has officials who look the other way. He has a system that works perfectly as long as nobody questions it. And Daniel questioned it. Daniel tried to prove the deeds were forgeries, tried to show that Victor had stolen everything through fraud and intimidation. He was getting close. He had witnesses ready to testify. He had evidence. And then he died and all those witnesses went silent and all that evidence disappeared. Sarah felt the pieces clicking together in her mind, forming a pattern she'd seen before in a dozen other towns. Corruption didn't usually come with masks and threats. It came with smiles and handshakes and legal documents that looked legitimate enough to fool anyone who didn't look too close. It came with men like Victor Stone, who'd learned that you didn't need a gun to rob people if you had a lawyer and a crooked clerk. You said I should know something before I started digging. Sarah's voice was quiet. What should I know? Grace's hand stilled on the bar. She looked at Emma, who nodded encouragingly. Then she looked back at Sarah, and her young face carried a weight no 16-year-old should have to bear. Daniel wasn't my father, not my real father. He adopted me after my mother died, raised me, taught me, loved me like I was his own blood. But my real father, she swallowed hard, my real father is Victor Stone, and he knows I exist. He just chose his money over his daughter. Sarah processed this. Victor has another daughter, Emily. He saved her life with the money he stole. His daughter from his first marriage, Grace said bitterly. Emily's mother was respectable. Mine was a barmaid Victor took up with after his wife died. When my mother died, giving birth to me, Victor couldn't bear the scandal. A bastard daughter from the wrong side of town. So he handed me to Daniel and pretended I didn't exist. The words fell into silence like stones into a well. Sarah felt them land, felt the ripples spread outward, felt the shape of the truth become suddenly terribly clear. Daniel hadn't just been fighting corruption. He'd been fighting for a child, for Grace, to give her a father worth having when her biological father had abandoned her for profit. Does Victor know you're here, living with Emma? He knows, he doesn't care. Or maybe he cares too much, and that's why he stays away. Either way, I haven't seen him in 2 years. Not since Daniel died. Not since he chose to let the man who raised me die rather than risk his empire. Sarah reached across the bar and placed her hand over Grace's. The girl's fingers were cold. I'm going to make this right. I don't know how yet, but I promise you Daniel didn't die for nothing. Don't make promises you might not be able to keep, Grace said quietly. That's what Daniel always told me. Don't promise, just do. Smart kid. Daniel had taught her well. Sarah nodded, withdrawing her hand. Then I won't promise. I'll just do. The saloon door swung open, spilling afternoon sunlight across the floor. 3 men entered, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. They weren't subtle about their entrance, weren't trying to be. They spread out in a pattern Sarah recognized immediately, the kind of formation men use when they want to intimidate, when they wanted to make sure their target understands they're surrounded and outmatched. The man in the center was lean and sharp-faced, with a smile that came too easily and meant nothing. The one on the left was taller, long-armed, with restless eyes that cataloged exits and weapons. The one on the right was built like a wall, thick through the shoulders, blocking half the light from the doorway. Brothers, Sarah guessed. Family resemblance in the nose and jaw. Thugs by profession, judging from the way they wore their guns and carried themselves. Well now, the lean one said, his voice carrying that particular drawl men use when they think they're being charming. Looks like Red Hollow got itself some fresh blood. You passing through, lady, or you planning to stay? Sarah didn't turn to look at, just took a sip of her water, eyes on Grace and Emma. Depends. Town got a problem with visitors? Depends on the visitor. Some folks they're welcome, some folks they're not. The man moved closer, boots heavy on the floorboards. Name's Cole Stone. These are my brothers, Levi and Brute. Our daddy runs things around here, keeps the peace, makes sure everyone plays nice. Peace. Sarah finally turned, giving them her full attention. Not aggressive, not defensive, just looking, taking their measure. That what you call it when 4 men die in one night and nobody investigates? The smile died on Cole's face. Levi's hand drifted toward his gun. Brute took a step forward, his shadow falling across Sarah like a threat. The other drinkers in the saloon suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere, melting toward the exit with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned when to make themselves scarce. You got a mouth on you, Cole said, the friendliness gone from his voice. Might want to watch what comes out of it. Words can get people hurt in Red Hollow, especially people who don't know how things work here. Sarah set down her glass with deliberate care, stood slowly. She was several inches shorter than Cole Half-Brute's weight and had at least 10 years on Levi. The smart money would have been on the 3-armed men, but Sarah had spent 15 years learning that fights weren't won by the biggest or the strongest. They were won by the fastest, the smartest, and the most willing to do what needed doing. Let me tell you how I think things work, she said quietly. I think your daddy built himself a nice little operation. Skims money from the miners, takes a cut from the businesses, calls it protection. Makes sure nobody asks questions by making sure anyone who does ask ends up dead or gone. I think he's got people on his payroll, officials who look the other way, enforcers who make sure everyone stays in line. And I think he's got 3 sons who aren't smart enough to build an empire but are just dumb enough to think they can hold on to one. Cole's face flushed red. You need to shut your mouth right now before I shut it for you. Or what? Sarah tilted her head slightly. You're going to hit a woman in the middle of a crowded saloon, make a scene, draw attention. That's not how your operation works, is it? Your daddy's smarter than that. Violence is messy. Witnesses are problems. He'd rather scare people into submission than beat them. Cleaner that way, more sustainable. Then maybe we'll just escort you out of town. Make sure you understand you're not welcome. Try it. The 2 words hung in the air like a challenge. Cole looked at his brothers. Some unspoken communication passed between them. Then he moved, hand reaching out to grab Sarah's arm, probably planning to twist it, cause pain make her comply without making a spectacle. He never got the chance. Sarah moved like water flowing around his grasp, her own hand shooting up to catch his wrist. She twisted, not hard enough to break, but hard enough to hurt, and Cole gasped as leverage forced him forward. His hand went instinctively to his holster, and that was when Sarah's other hand caught his throat. Not squeezing, not threatening, just reminding him how little breath it takes to end a man, how little strength is needed when applied to the right pressure points. Levi drew his gun. The barrel barely cleared leather before Sarah's elbow struck his wrist, the impact precise and brutal. Metal clattered to the floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Levi stared at his empty hand like it had betrayed him. Brute charged, no finesse, no strategy, just bulk and rage. Sarah stepped into his charge rather than away from it, using his momentum against him. A shift of weight, a hooked foot, a sharp drive of her shoulder into his center mass. Physics did the rest. Brute crashed into the bar bottles, rattling one shattering and spilling whiskey across polished wood. Then nothing. Just breathing. Just three men on the floor, or clutching injuries, or staring at their fallen gun. Just Sarah standing in the center of the room, not even breathing hard. She looked at each of them in turn. "I'm not here to make trouble," she said quietly. "I'm here to bury my uncle and find out who killed him. If that makes me unwelcome, so be it. But understand this. I'm not some drifter you can push around. I'm not some merchant you can intimidate. I'm a deputy marshal who was trained by the best lawman this territory ever saw. And I'm not leaving Red Hollow until I finish what Daniel started." She reached into her coat and pulled out $2 silver, setting them on the bar. "One for my water, one for the bottle. My apologies about the mess." Emma stared at her, something like awe mixing with fear on her weathered face. Grace's eyes were wide, her young face showing a mixture of shock and something that might have been hope. The three Stone brothers remained where they were, calculating whether their pride was worth another round. A voice cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary." Everyone turned. A man stood in the doorway, older than Sarah by 20 years, with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had seen more than their share of bad decisions. He wore simple clothes, working man's attire, but he carried himself with a quiet dignity that spoke of someone who'd once been more than he currently was. "Ben Tucker," Emma said, relief evident in her voice. "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should they," Ben said, nodding toward the Stone brothers. "Cole Levi Brute, your daddy know you're here harassing women." "Wasn't harassing," Cole muttered, getting to his feet and trying to salvage some dignity. "Just delivering a message." "Message received," Sarah said. "Now deliver one back to Victor. Tell him Daniel Reed's niece is in town. Tell him I've got questions. And tell him I won't stop asking them until I get answers." The brothers left, wounded pride wrapped around them like cloaks. The door swung shut behind them, and the saloon seemed to exhale collectively. Ben Tucker moved to the bar, nodding to Emma, offering Grace a gentle smile, then turning his full attention to Sarah. "Ma'am, I don't know if you're brave or foolish, but either way, you just made yourself a target. Victor Stone doesn't forget insults, doesn't forgive challenges. You need to understand what you're walking into." "Then tell me." Ben ordered whiskey. Emma poured without asking questions. He drank it neat in one swallow, then set the glass down with the careful precision of a man who knew his limits with alcohol and respected them. "My brother Marcus worked at the Iron Creek mine. Good man, honest. He kept the books, made sure everyone got paid fair wages. Then he noticed discrepancies, money missing, records altered, small amounts at first, then bigger. He came to Daniel, told him what he'd found. Daniel started investigating. And your brother? Died 2 days later. Fell down a mine shaft, they said. Drunk, they claimed. But Marcus never touched liquor, never worked at night, never had any reason to be in that shaft." Ben's voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly as he turned the empty glass. "They killed Heat because he knew too much, just like they killed Daniel. Just like they'll kill anyone who asks too many questions." Sarah looked at him, really looked, and saw beneath the calm exterior to the rage burning low and constant. This was a man who'd swallowed his anger for 2 years, who'd been waiting for someone to give him permission to let it out. She knew that kind of patience, had felt it herself. "You want justice for your brother? I want the truth, whatever that brings." Sarah reached into her coat and pulled out a second badge, this one new enough that the silver still shone. Deputy Marshal stamped with federal authority. She'd carried it for 3 years since the territorial governor had given her the right to enforce the law anywhere in Arizona. She set it on the bar next to her glass. "I can't do this alone. Red Hollow doesn't trust outsiders, but they might trust one of their own. Someone who's bled with them. Someone who's lost what they have lost." She met Ben's eyes. "You willing to wear this, knowing it might get you killed?" Ben stared at the badge for a long moment, His hand reached out, hesitated, then picked it up. The metal was heavy in his palm, heavier than it looked, heavy with all the weight of what it represented. "I'll try," he said quietly. "That's all the law ever asks." Night fell over Red Hollow like a blanket over a corpse. Sarah stood on the balcony outside her rented room above the saloon, watching the town settle into darkness. Lights flickered in windows. Voices carried on the desert wind. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere else a child laughed. Normal sounds of normal lives in a town that had learned to pretend everything was fine. Across the street and two buildings down, a light burned in an upstairs office. Sarah didn't need to ask whose office it was. She could feel Victor Stone's presence like a weight pressing down on the town. Could imagine him standing at his window looking out over his domain, calculating how to deal with this new problem. A shot cracked through the night, not close, not aimed at her, but close enough to be a message. Sarah's hand went to her gun, but she didn't draw, didn't duck, just stood there counting seconds waiting to see if another shot would follow. It didn't. When she looked down, she saw a small hole in the wooden railing 6 inches from her left hand. Fresh splinters gleamed white in the moonlight. Not a miss, a warning. Victor Stone was telling her he could reach her whenever he wanted, that her life existed at his sufferance, that she should be afraid. Sarah reached out and touched the hole, feeling the rough edges, the torn wood. She thought about Daniel, about Grace, about Ben, and his dead brother, and all the other people Victor had hurt in his climb to power. She thought about the badge in her pocket and the oath she'd taken and the promise she'd made to a dead man who'd believed the law meant something. Then she went inside, closed the door, and began planning her next move, because Victor Stone had made a mistake. He'd shown her he was afraid, and frightened men made mistakes. All she had to do was wait for him to make the one that would bring his empire down. In his office across town, Victor Stone stood at his window, watching the light go out in Sarah's room. His hand trembled as he set down his whiskey glass. Thomas Pike stood behind him, nervous as always, waiting for instructions. "She's not leaving," Victor said quietly. "What do you want me to do?" Victor was silent for a long moment. Then he turned, and in his eyes was something that might have been regret, or might have been resignation, or might have been both. "Send word to Copper Ridge. Tell them I need Jack Kane. Tell him I'm paying double his usual rate." "Kane," Pike's voice cracked. "Sir, that's what it takes. Sarah Hart isn't some drifter I can scare off. Daniel trained her. She's got the law on her side. She's got the truth or enough of it to be dangerous. And she's got nothing to lose." Victor picked up his glass, again hands still shaking. "Kane is a professional. Clean, quick, no witnesses, no complications. Just a body in a closed case. And if he fails, Rattler Kane doesn't fail. That's why they call him Rattler. You never hear him coming until the poison's already in your veins." Pike left to send the message. Victor stood alone in his office, surrounded by the trappings of his success: expensive furniture, fine liquor, legal documents that proved his ownership of half of Red Hollow. None of it felt like victory anymore. All of it felt like chains binding him to choices he couldn't undo, to a path he couldn't leave. He thought about Daniel Reed, about 15 years of friendship that had died in a single gunshot, about promises broken and trust shattered, and the moment when power had become more important than honor. He thought about Grace, his daughter, who he'd abandoned because acknowledging her would mean acknowledging what he'd become. And he thought about Sarah Hart, who was everything Daniel had hoped she'd be: strong, principled, unwilling to compromise. Coming to Red Hollow not for revenge but for justice, which was somehow worse because justice couldn't be negotiated or bribed or scared away. The whiskey tasted like ash in his mouth. Victor set down the glass and walked to his safe. Inside, beneath account books and property deeds, was a photograph, faded now, edges worn from handling. It showed two young men in marshals' uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera like they owned the world. Victor Stone and Daniel Reed, brothers in everything but blood, for the choices, before the compromise, before everything went wrong. He closed the safe and turned back to his window. Red Hollow slept below him, unaware of the storm gathering on his horizon. Unaware that in 3 days a man named Jack Kane would ride into town with one purpose and one target. Unaware that the fragile peace they'd learned to live with was about to shatter completely. Sarah Hart lay in her rented bed, eyes open, staring at shadows on the ceiling. She wasn't sleeping, might not sleep for days. Her mind was already racing ahead, mapping out possibilities, planning her next moves, anticipating Victor's responses. Daniel's badge lay on the bedside table, catching moonlight from the window. Tomorrow she'd start asking questions. Tomorrow she'd begin pulling threads, seeing what unraveled. Tomorrow the real work would begin. But tonight she allowed herself one moment of doubt, one moment of wondering if she was strong enough, smart enough, lucky enough to finish what Daniel had started. One moment of feeling the weight of expectations from the living and the dead. Then she pushed the doubt away, closed her eyes, and began running through her plan again. Because doubt was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not in Red Hollow, not with Victor Stone and whatever he was planning, not with Grace counting on her and Ben trusting her and Daniel's ghost watching from whatever place the honored dead go. The night deepened, the stars wheeled overhead, and Red Hollow held its breath, waiting to see what the morning would bring. Morning came to Red Hollow with reluctance, as if the sun itself hesitated to illuminate what the night had hidden. Sarah stood in Daniel's old office, dust motes dancing in shafts of pale light that filtered through unwashed windows. The room still smelled of him, leather and gun oil, and the faint trace of pipe tobacco he'd smoked when he thought no one was watching. 2 years hadn't been enough to erase his presence from these walls. Ben Tucker arrived at dawn carrying coffee and the wary look of a man who'd spent a sleepless night questioning every decision that had led him to this moment. He set the cups on Daniel's desk, now Sarah's desk, and took the chair across from her without being asked. The deputy badge gleamed on his chest, still unfamiliar, still heavy. "Word's already spreading," he said quietly. "About yesterday, about the Stone brothers. People are talking. Some are hopeful. Most are scared. Scared is natural. Scared keeps people alive." Sarah sipped the coffee strong and bitter, exactly how she needed it. But scared can't be all they feel. Not if we're going to make this work. What exactly are we making work? You planning to arrest Victor Stone on what charges? With what evidence? Ben leaned forward, hands clasped between his knees. "I'm with you, Marshal. But I need to know the plan isn't just stirring up trouble and hoping something shakes loose." Sarah pulled out a worn notebook, Daniel's handwriting, filling page after page with careful observations, dates, names, amounts. She'd found it in the hidden compartment, along with his letter, a chronicle of 2 years' worth of investigation condensed into cramped lines and margin notes. Daniel was methodical. He didn't just know Victor was stealing, he documented how. Every fraudulent deed, every forged signature, every witness who saw something they shouldn't have seen. She flipped through pages, each one a small piece of a larger puzzle. But documentation isn't enough. We need people willing to speak, to stand up in front of the town and say what they saw. You're asking people to sign their own death warrants. I'm asking them to decide if living in fear is the same as being alive. The first witness arrived an hour later, brought by Emma Walsh through the back entrance, hood pulled low despite the morning heat. His name was Samuel Hayes, 63 years old, weathered by sun and hardship, hands that shook when he sat down across from Sarah. His eyes held the particular exhaustion that comes from carrying secrets too heavy to bear alone. Sarah didn't rush him, just sat waiting, letting him gather courage in his own time. Ben stood by the door watching the street through a gap in the curtain. Emma made tea that nobody would drink, the ritual of preparation giving Hayes something to focus on besides his fear. Victor Stone came to Red Hollow in 1880, Hayes began, his voice rough as old rope. Back then he was still wearing a badge. Good man, or seemed like it. Helped people. Saved a child from a runaway wagon. Talked down a drunk with the kind of lawman you want in your town. What changed? Sarah's pen moved across fresh paper, recording every word. His daughter, Emily, sweet little thing, maybe 8 years old, got sick, real sick. Fever that wouldn't break, cough that sounded like tearing fabric. Doctor said she needed surgery in Denver. Special kind, the kind that costs $2,000 when a marshal makes $60 a month. Hayes paused, fingers whirring at the brim of his hat. Outside, a wagon rattled past. Someone called a greeting. Normal sounds of a town pretending to be normal. Victor started asking for donations, called it a community fund. Most folks gave what they could, but it wasn't enough. Never going to be enough. So he started offering protection. Just a little extra, he said. Few dollars a month to make sure your business stayed safe, your property stayed yours. Most people paid. Seemed reasonable at the time. And Daniel told him no. Said it was extortion dressed up pretty. Said a lawman doesn't take money from the people he's sworn to protect. They had words, loud ones, in the street where everyone could hear. Hayes's eyes went distant, remembering. Daniel reported Victor to the territorial marshal. Victor got stripped of his badge, but by then he had enough money to save Emily, and enough anger to never forgive Daniel for taking everything else. Sarah wrote it all down, the foundation of Victor's empire, built on desperation and a father's love, twisted into something darker. She could understand it even while condemning it. That was the tragedy of men like Victor Stone. They didn't start as villains. They started as fathers who couldn't watch their children die. After he lost the badge, Victor bought the mine. Don't know where he got the money, but he bought it legal or legal enough. Then he started buying other things, businesses that suddenly needed cash. Properties whose owners suddenly wanted to leave town. Always legal, always documented, always leaving people wondering how he managed to be in the right place at exactly the right time. You're saying he forced these sales? I'm saying people who said no to Victor had a way of changing their minds, or having accidents, or deciding Red Hollow wasn't healthy for them anymore. Hayes met her eyes directly. My son Thomas, he owned a freight company. Victor wanted to buy it. Thomas said no. 2 weeks later, Thomas's warehouse burned down. Every wagon, every harness, every bit of stock. Investigators said it was an accident. Lantern knocked over. But Thomas didn't smoke. Didn't use lanterns in the warehouse. Had rules about fire. What did Thomas do? Sold to Victor for half what it was worth before the fire. Then he left town. Didn't even say goodbye. Just left a note saying he was sorry he couldn't be stronger. The old man's voice cracked. I haven't seen my son in 4 years. Don't know if he's alive or dead. Don't know if he thinks about his old father or if he's trying to forget everything about Red Hollow. Sarah reached across the desk and placed her hand over his. The gesture surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise him. She wasn't given to comfort. Daniel had taught her to be professional, distant, to not let emotions cloud judgment. But some moments required more than professional distance. Thank you for telling me this. I know it wasn't easy. Hayes stood, knees creaking, age and hard living, taking their toll. You going to be able to stop him? Really stop him? Or are you just going to make things worse before you leave like everyone else who's tried? I'm going to try, that's all I can promise. Daniel said the same thing. Hayes moved toward the door, then paused. There's something else you should know. About Grace, about who her father really is. Sarah nodded slowly. I know. Victor Stone. The old man's eyebrows rose. You know how? Grace told me yesterday, soon as I arrived. That girl's got more courage than most men in this town. Victor abandoned her when his wife died, just walked away. Said he couldn't look at her without seeing what he'd lost. Daniel took her in, raised her, loved her like she was his own blood. Hayes's voice hardened. That's why Victor killed him, not just because of the investigation, because Daniel was a better father to Victor's daughter than Victor ever was. Some men can't forgive being shown up like that. After Hayes left, Sarah sat in silence, processing what she'd learned. Ben remained at the window, patient, giving her time to think. Emma had slipped him out during the testimony, understanding that some conversations needed privacy. 3 more witnesses coming today, Ben said finally. Emma's bringing them one at a time. Different entrances, different times, so nobody sees a pattern. Good. We need to build a case strong enough that even corrupt officials can't ignore it. Sarah closed the notebook, Daniel's handwriting hidden again. But testimony isn't enough. We need the documents Victor used, the forged deeds, the fraudulent contracts. Without proof his paperwork is fake, it's just our word against his lawyers. Those documents would be in Victor's safe, in his office, which is guarded day and night. Ben turned from the window. You planning to break in? I'm planning to make him come to us, make him nervous enough that he makes mistakes. Scared men get sloppy. They rush. They trust the wrong people. They leave evidence where they shouldn't. The second witness was a Chinese woman named Lin Chen, wife of the man who discovered Victor's theft from the miners. She spoke softly, hands folded in her lap, recounting in careful English how her husband had been good with numbers, how Victor had hired him to audit the mine's books, how Lin had found discrepancies that added up to thousands of dollars stolen from workers who could least afford to lose anything. He was going to tell Marshall Reed. Mrs. Chen said, her accent thick, but her meaning clear. He had proof, pages and pages showing where money went, not to mine operation, not to workers, to Victor's private accounts. What happened to those pages? Burned, the night my husband died. Men came to our house, polite men, smiling men. They asked where Lynn was. I said Denver on business. They said they would wait. I told Lynn to run out back while I talked to them. But they knew. They were waiting there too. Her composure cracked, tears sliding down weathered cheeks. I heard him call my name. Then I heard the shot. Then nothing. They came back through the house still smiling and told me my husband had tried to run. Said he must have had a guilty conscience. Said I should remember that talking about things that weren't my business could be dangerous for a woman alone. Sarah's jaw tightened, the calculated cruelty of it. The message delivered with smiles and politeness. Violence wrapped in courtesy was somehow more obscene than honest brutality. They never found his body, Mrs. Chen continued. Officially, Lin Chen left town, abandoned his wife, no crime committed, no investigation needed. But I know he's dead. I know they killed him. And I know I should have died too, except they decided a scared widow was more useful than a dead one. Why come forward now? Because I'm tired of being scared. Because my husband deserves justice. Because if I don't speak now, when will I ever? She looked at Sarah with eyes that had seen the worst humanity could offer and kept looking anyway. You remind me of him, my Lynn. He also believed some things were worth the risk. The third witness arrived as afternoon shadows began their slow stretch across floorboards. James Garrett's shopkeeper, 70 years old with hands that trembled from age and memory. He'd seen something the night Daniel died, something that had haunted him for 2 years. I was closing my store, late, maybe 11 o'clock, heard voices outside. He spoke slowly, carefully, like a man navigating a minefield of memory. Recognized them, Daniel and Victor, arguing, not shouting but angry, the kind of angry that's worse than shouting. What were they saying? Daniel said Victor had gone too far, said he couldn't cover for him anymore. Victor said they were brothers, that brothers forgave each other. Garrett's voice dropped to barely above whisper. Then Daniel said something I didn't understand at the time. He said Grace needs to know the truth. She needs to know what kind of man her father really is. Sarah's pen stilled on the page. He said father, not adoptive father, just father. I thought he meant Victor. Thought maybe Daniel was threatening to tell Grace that her real father was a criminal. But now, Garrett looked at her. Daniel was Grace's father by choice, by love, by every measure that matters except blood. He was saying Grace deserved to know Victor had abandoned her, that her real father had chosen money over his own child. What happened after that? Victor's voice changed, got quiet, dangerous quiet. He said, you wouldn't dare. Daniel said, I already have. I wrote her a letter. She'll get it when she turns 18. She'll know everything. Then I heard a sound, a scuffle maybe, then the gunshot, then silence so deep it hurt to hear. You saw them. I saw shadows, saw one man fall, saw another man stand over him. Then the second man walked away, walked past my window. I could have looked, could have seen his face clearly. But shame colored his words. I hid, ducked down behind my counter and hid like a coward while Daniel Reed bled to death 20 feet away. You couldn't have saved him. The bullet killed him instantly. Maybe, but I could have been a witness, could have testified, could have made sure his killer faced justice. Instead, I told the investigators I heard nothing, saw nothing. Just another shopkeeper minding my own business. Sarah studied him, seeing the weight of guilt he'd carried, understanding that coming forward now was his attempt at redemption. Some men spent their lives running from their failures. Others eventually turned and faced them. Garrett was facing his. I need you to write down everything you remember, every word, every sound, Every detail, no matter how small. Will it be enough 2 years later? An old man's memory. It's a piece combined with the others. Maybe it becomes something bigger. Sarah handed him paper and pen. Write it down, sign it, date it. Then go home and don't talk to anyone about being here. After Garrett left, Sarah sat alone in the fading light reading through the testimonies. 3 witnesses, 3 different perspectives on the same systematic destruction of a town's soul. Separately, they were just stories. Together, they began to form a pattern, a map of corruption that led back to one man. But patterns weren't proof. Stories weren't evidence. And Victor Stone had lawyers who knew how to make inconvenient truths disappear into legal technicalities. She needed more. Needed the smoking gun. Needed something Victor couldn't explain away or bearish way under paperwork. She was still thinking about what that might be when Grace appeared in the doorway, face flushed from running. You need to see something. Sarah followed Grace through back streets, moving with purpose, but not panic, attracting no attention from the few people still out as evening settled over Red Hollow. They ended up at Emma's private quarters above the saloon, where Emma waited with a document spread across her small kitchen table. I found this in Daniel's things, Emma said, not meeting Sarah's eyes. After he died, I went through everything, looking for, I don't know, something, maybe a letter, maybe an explanation. I found this instead. Kept it hidden. Didn't know what to do with it. Didn't know who to trust. Sarah bent over the table examining the document by lamplight. A deed. Transfer of ownership for the Iron Creek mine from the town of Red Hollow to Victor Stone. Dated March 15, 1881. Signed by Daniel Reed in his capacity as town marshal and legal representative. Why didn't you show this to anyone? Because it's real. Daniel's signature. Genuine. I've seen his writing enough to know. And if it's real, if Daniel really signed over the mine to Victor, then maybe everything we believed about him was wrong. Maybe he was part of it. Maybe, Emma's voice broke. Maybe the man I loved wasn't who I thought he was. Sarah studied the signature. Emma was right. It looked authentic. The way Daniel formed his R, the slight downward slant of his E, the careful precision of his full name written out instead of initialed. Every detail matched hundreds of other documents she'd seen signed by her uncle over the years. Did you check Daniel's records? His calendar? Anything that would show where he was on this date? Emma handed her a small journal, leather-bound pages filled with Daniel's daily notations. March 15, 1881 showed a single entry, Silver City, testimony in Brennan case. He wasn't even in Red Hollow, Sarah said slowly. Couldn't have signed this, so either this document is fake or someone else signed it. Or Daniel signed it before he left, Grace offered quietly. Gave it to someone he trusted, someone who could file it while he was gone. Sarah looked up sharply. Who would he trust with something like that? His clerk, Thomas Pike. Grace's voice was barely audible. He was Daniel's assistant back then. Daniel taught him everything, including how to forge his signature for routine paperwork when Daniel was out of town. The pieces clicked together with awful clarity. Thomas Pike, now town administrator, wealthy beyond what his salary could explain, always nervous, always sweating. Pike, who'd been in position to forge Daniel's signature. Pike, who could have created legal documents that looked legitimate because he'd been trained by the very man he was betraying. We need to talk to Pike's mother, Sarah said. Emma, you know her, Dorothy Pike. Lives alone on the edge of town. Her son bought her a house with his first big payoff from Victor. She's never forgiven him for it. They found Dorothy Pike in a small house that smelled of age and regret, sitting in a rocking chair that creaked with each movement. She was 70 if she was a day, with eyes that had witnessed too much compromise and hands that shook from something other than age. When she saw Grace, her face crumpled. Oh, child, you look so much like your mother. She was beautiful, kind. Victor didn't deserve her. Grace knelt beside the old woman's chair. Mrs. Pike, we need your help. We need to know about your son, about what he did for Victor Stone. The old woman was quiet for a long time, rocking slowly the chair's rhythm like a heartbeat. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded letter, edges worn soft from handling. Thomas wrote this 3 years ago, meant to kill himself. I stopped him, took away his gun and made him promise to live. But I kept the letter. Kept it because someday someone would need to know the truth. Sarah unfolded the paper with careful hands. Read words written in a shaking hand, confession pouring out in desperate lines. Thomas Pike admitting he'd forged Daniel's signature on dozens of documents. Admitting Victor had paid him $5,000 to create a paper trail that made theft look legal. Admitting he'd known men would die because of what he'd done and doing it anyway because he was weak and scared and desperate for money that felt like safety. Why didn't you come forward with this? Sarah's voice was gentle despite the anger building in her chest. Because he's my son. Because I'm a foolish old woman who loves her child even when her child is a coward and a criminal. Because I told myself that keeping him alive was more important than justice. Dorothy Pike looked at Grace with eyes full of tears. But Daniel Reed loved you the way a father should, died protecting you, and my son helped kill him. That debt can't go unpaid forever. We need to arrest Thomas Pike, Ben said when they returned to the office. He'd spent the day watching, waiting, keeping track of movements and patterns. Bring him in. Make him testify against Victor. Not yet. Sarah placed the letter in Daniel's hidden compartment, safe with the other evidence. If we move on Pike now, Victor will know we have the proof. He'll have time to cover his tracks, maybe disappear entirely. We need to use this at the right moment, when it will hurt most. So what do? We go to Iron Creek tomorrow, talk to the miners, let Victor know we're not just asking questions, we're taking action. The Iron Creek mine sprawled across the eastern hills like a wound in the earth, scarred and ugly and profitable. 200 men worked there extracting silver from rock, living in camps that were barely better than the holes they dug. Sarah and Ben rode in at dawn when the day shift was gathering and the night shift was stumbling back to sleep. The foreman, Jake Martinez, was a big man, gone to fat with eyes that had seen too many men die for too little money. He didn't look happy to see a federal marshal and a new deputy riding toward his office. We don't want trouble here, he said before Sarah could speak. Men work, men get paid. That's all that matters. How much do they get paid? $1.20 a day, industry standard. And how much does Victor Stone take out before they get that $1.20? Martinez's jaw tightened. Protection fee. 10%. Keeps everyone safe. Safe from what? Accidents, injuries, things that happen in mines when owners aren't careful about maintenance. Sarah looked past him to where miners were gathering listening. Tired men with tired eyes bent from labors, old before their time. Men who'd spent their lives making other men rich while staying poor themselves. Victor Stone doesn't own this mine, she said loud enough for everyone to hear. The documents he has are forgeries, created by a clerk he bribed, signed with a dead man's name by someone who was trained to fake that signature. The murmuring started, low at first, then building. Martinez's face went red, then white, then red again. You can't just come in here making accusations. Mr. Stone has lawyers, has judges, has people who will say you're lying. I have proof, written confession, testimony from witnesses, evidence that will hold up in any court that isn't bought and paid for. Sarah dismounted, walked closer to the gathered miners. I'm offering you a choice. Keep paying Victor Stone to steal from you. Or stand up. Say no. Take back what's yours. A voice from the crowd. And when Victor's men come, when they start burning our homes, hurting our families, then you'll have a federal marshal and the territorial law backing you. Not promises, legal authority, real protection. Jake Martinez stepped forward. He was trembling, whether from anger or fear, Sarah couldn't tell. You're asking us to risk everything. Our jobs, our lives, for what? For justice. Justice doesn't feed hungry kids. No, but it might give them a future worth living in. The miners talked among themselves, arguing, debating, fear fighting with hope, fighting with exhaustion. Finally, Martinez turned back to Sarah. We'll do it. We'll refuse to pay. But if this goes wrong, if Victor comes down on us, you better not run. I won't run. That's a promise. They rode back to town in silence, both understanding that they just lit a fuse. Now they had to wait and see what exploded. They didn't have to wait long. By afternoon, Victor's collectors had arrived at Iron Creek expecting their usual payment. By evening, they'd returned to town empty-handed and angry. By sunset, Victor Stone was standing in the street outside Daniel's office, face dark with rage, 20 men behind him. Sarah met him on the porch. Didn't hide. Didn't back down, just stood there, hand resting easy near her gun waiting. You're making a mistake, Victor said, his voice carrying that dangerous calm of a man holding on to control by fingernails. Those miners need to work, need their jobs. You're going to cost them everything. The only thing I'm costing them is your theft. They'll work. They'll get paid. They just won't pay you for the privilege of breaking their backs. The mine is mine, legally purchased, properly documented. You have no right. Your documents are forgeries. I can prove it. I will prove it. And when I do, everything you've built comes down. Victor's hand moved toward his gun. So did the hands of his men. The street held its breath. Sarah didn't flinch. Ben stepped out of the office behind her, his own hand ready. From windows, from doorways, from shadows, other people appeared. Not many, but enough. Miners who'd followed from Iron Creek, shopkeepers who'd lost businesses, families who'd buried loved ones under suspicious circumstances. Red Hollow was choosing sides. Victor saw it too, saw the calculation shift, saw that violence here now in front of witnesses would cost more than he could afford. He lowered his hand slowly. His men followed suit, but his eyes promised this wasn't over. You should have stayed away, Sarah. Should have let the dead stay buried. Daniel was my family. Grace is under my protection. And this town deserves better than living in fear of you. Victor turned and walked away, his men following. But Sarah saw him stop at the end of the street, saw him speak to a rider who'd just arrived, saw money change hands, saw the rider nod and turn his horse back the way he'd come. What was that? Ben asked. That was Victor calling in reinforcements, hiring someone to solve his problem. Sarah watched the rider disappear in a cloud of dust. Someone who does things Victor doesn't want to do himself. You think he hired a killer? I think we just became too dangerous to scare off, which means Victor's going to try something more permanent. The name reached Red Hollow before the man did. Rattler Kane. Spoken in whispers passed from person to person like a contagion. 30 kills, 30 gunfights, never lost, never even wounded. A professional who approached killing the way other men approached carpentry, with practiced skill and no emotional investment. Sarah heard the name and felt ice in her gut. She'd heard of Kane. Every lawman in the territory had heard of him. He didn't kill for pleasure or anger or any of the usual reasons men killed each other. He killed because that's what he was good at, because people paid him, because it was business. We should leave, Grace said that night, voice small in the darkness of Emma's kitchen. All of us, before he gets here. Leave and go where? Sarah asked gently. Leave and let Victor win. Leave and watch from a distance while he continues destroying lives. Better than dying. Is living with yourself after running away better than dying while standing up? Sarah reached across the table and took Grace's hand. Your father, your real father, in all the ways that matter, died because he wouldn't run. Because he believed some things were worth the cost. And look where it got him, dead, buried, forgotten by everyone except the people who loved him. Not forgotten, never forgotten. Daniel Reed's name still means something in Red Hollow. Still stands for something. That's worth more than survival at any cost. Grace pulled her hand away, angry, scared, 16 years old and tired of being brave. You sound just like him. All noble words and righteous principles. Where does that leave the people who care about you? Where does that leave me when you're dead and I'm alone again? Sarah had no answer, because Grace was right. There was a selfishness in righteousness. A cost paid by those left behind. Daniel had paid it. Sarah was about to pay it. And Grace, who'd already lost one father, was being asked to risk losing another. Emma broke the silence. Kane's not coming for days yet. Has to ride from Copper Ridge. That's 3 days minimum. Maybe 4 if he takes his time. We have options. Can prepare. Can plan. Or we can end this before he arrives, Ben said. He'd been quiet, listening, thinking. Go after Victor now, tonight. Arrest him on what we have. Force his hand. Not enough evidence yet. His lawyers would have him free in hours. We need Pike's confession on record. Need the forged documents in hand. Need enough proof that even corrupt judges can't ignore it. So we wait for a killer to arrive and hope we're faster. No, we make sure that when Kane does arrive, he finds a town that won't back down. that won't scatter when he rides in, because men like Cain, they depend on fear, on isolation, on their targets being alone and helpless. We take away his advantage. Rattler Cain rode into Red Hollow 3 days later, exactly when Sarah had expected. High noon, because men like Cain understood theater. Understood that timing mattered, that entrance mattered, that reputation did half the work before a gun ever cleared leather. He was younger than Sarah expected. Maybe 38, with the kind of lean build that spoke of efficiency rather than strength. His clothes were well maintained. His horse was calm and healthy. His gun hung at his hip in a snakeskin holster that had given him his nickname, the leather polished to a dark shine by use. He didn't look like a monster. That was the thing about evil. It usually didn't. Red Hollow went quiet when he arrived. Doors closed, windows shuttered, people disappeared like smoke. The main street emptied except for Cain, his horse, and the dust that rose around them. He tied his mount outside the Dustfall Saloon, not because he needed a drink, but because it was the center of town, the place where everyone would know he'd arrived. Sarah watched from Daniel's office window. Ben stood beside her, hand trembling slightly near his gun. Emma had taken Grace somewhere safe, somewhere Cain wouldn't look for them. The town held its breath. Cain entered the saloon. Sarah waited 5 minutes, then followed. Time to see what kind of man Victor Stone had bought. She found him sitting at a table near the back coffee in front of him, hat tilted back enough to see his face clearly. He didn't look up when she entered. Didn't need to. He'd known she would come. Marshall Hart. Mr. Cain. Coffee's good here. Better than I expected for a town this size. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit. We should talk. Sarah sat, kept her hands visible. Cain did the same. Professional courtesy between professionals who might be about to kill each other. Victor Stone hired you. He did. To kill me. To remind you of your mortality. Whether that reminder requires your death remains to be seen. Cain sipped his coffee, eyes never leaving hers. I'm told you're here investigating corruption, trying to prove Victor Stone built his empire illegally. That's accurate. And you're doing this because Daniel Reed was your uncle, your mentor, the man who taught you everything about being a marshal. Also accurate, Cain nodded slowly. I met Daniel Reed once, 5 years ago, Silver City. I was there on business. He was testifying in a case. We had dinner together, talked about the about what it costs, about whether the cost is worth it. His eyes held something that might have been sadness. He was a good man. I liked him. And yet you took money to help the man who killed him. I didn't know Victor killed him, not until I was already on the road here. By then the contract was made. My word was given. I don't break contracts. Cain leaned back in his chair. But I don't kill without necessity either. So I'm offering you a choice. Leave Red Hollow, today. I'll tell Victor you're dead. Give you a head start to somewhere he'll never find you. You get to live. I keep my word. Everyone wins. Except the people of Red Hollow, except Grace. Except everyone Victor's hurt and will continue hurting. Not your problem. You're one woman. He's built an empire. You can't win. Best you can do is survive. Sarah studied him, saw a man who'd made peace with what he was, who'd found a way to kill without it killing him back, who'd drawn lines around his conscience and convinced himself those lines made him different from common murderers. I have a daughter, Cain continued, 16 years old. She's in school in Denver. Smart girl, going to be a teacher someday. Everything I do for her. To give her opportunities I never had. To make sure she never has to do what I do. Daniel had a daughter too, adopted. Grace. You've probably seen her, blonde hair, blue eyes, 16 years old. Working in a saloon because her father was murdered and her blood father abandoned her. Something flickered across Cain's face. Victor Stone has a daughter. Had a daughter. He gave her up when his wife died. Couldn't stand to look at her. Daniel took her in, raised her, loved her the way a father should. And Victor killed him, partially because Daniel was investigating him, partially because he couldn't stand that someone else was being the father he'd failed to be. Cain was quiet for a long time. His coffee grew cold. Outside the town waited. Finally he spoke. That doesn't change my situation. I gave my word. Then I'll give you mine, tomorrow at dawn. Main Street, you and me. We settle this the way men like us settle things. One walks away, one doesn't. You sure about that? I'm very good at what I do. So am I. Kane stood, dropping his coins on the table for the coffee. Dawn, then. I'll be fair about it. Square draw. No tricks, no ambush, just skill against skill. That's all I ask. He walked to the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Daniel Reed deserved better than what he got, and you deserve better than dying in this dusty town. But we all die somewhere. At least you'll die standing up. After he left, Sarah sat alone in the empty saloon, feeling the weight of tomorrow settling onto her shoulders. She'd been in gunfights before, had killed men when necessary, but this was different. This was facing someone who did nothing but kill, someone who'd made an art of taking life. She wasn't sure she was fast enough, wasn't sure skill alone would be enough against someone who lived for this moment, who practiced for it, who'd survived 30 times before. But she was sure of one thing: she wouldn't run. Wouldn't abandon Red Hollow or Grace or the promise she'd made to a dead man. Ben found her an hour later. People are talking about tomorrow, about what you're planning. It's the only way. Kill Kane or be killed. Either way, it sends a message to Victor. Or it gets you buried next to Daniel and nothing changes. Then make sure something changes. If I die tomorrow, you arrest Victor. Use the evidence. Get Pike to confess. Finish what we started. I'm not a marshal. I'm a miner who wore a badge for a week. You're a man who stood up when standing up mattered. That makes you more of a marshal than most people who wear the badge. Sarah stood, feeling every year of her 33, feeling the accumulated weight of violence and death and choices that couldn't be unmade. Promise me, Ben, if I fall, you don't let it be for nothing. I promise. That night, Sarah sat with Grace in Emma's kitchen, the same place they'd sat before the same lamp burning low. Grace had been crying. Her eyes were red, her face blotched. She looked younger than 16, looked like the child she still was beneath the forced maturity that tragedy had thrust upon her. I can't lose you too, Grace whispered. I can't. It's not fair. It's not right. No, it's not. But life rarely is. Then run, please. Just run. I'll go with you. We'll leave tonight. Go somewhere Victor can't find us. Start over. Sarah wanted to say yes, wanted it so badly she could taste it, wanted to take this broken child and keep her safe, even if that safety came at the cost of justice, even if it meant abandoning everything else. The temptation was almost overwhelming. If I run, I teach you that fear wins, that standing up doesn't matter, that the strong can do whatever they want to the weak, and the weak just have to accept it. Sarah cupped Grace's face in her hands. Your father, Daniel, he taught me that some things are worth dying for. Worth the pull. I didn't understand when I was your age, but I understand now. I don't want to understand. I want you alive. I know, sweetheart, I know. They sat together in silence, holding on to each other, trying to find comfort in presence when words had run dry. Emma joined them, eventually bringing coffee. Nobody wanted sitting at the table, her own eyes haunted by the prospect of losing another person she'd begun to care about. Daniel sat right here, Emma said quietly, the night before he died. Drank his coffee, told me he loved me. First time he'd ever said it out loud. Then he left and I never saw him alive again. She looked at Sarah. I'm not asking you to run, not asking you to be anything but what you are. I'm just asking you to know that people care, that your life matters to more than just yourself. I know. Do you, because you're walking toward death like it's an appointment you can't break? Like dying is easier than disappointing people. The words hit hard because they held truth. Sarah had spent 15 years being what Daniel trained her to be. Being strong, being principled, being willing to pay any cost for justice. She'd become so good at it that she'd forgotten how to be anything else. How to be afraid. How to want more than duty and righteousness and the cold comfort of knowing she'd done the right thing. I don't know how to be anyone else, she admitted. Then maybe it's time to learn. Maybe surviving and compromising isn't the same as failing. Maybe choosing life over principle doesn't make you weak. Sarah thought about that through the long night, thought about it as she cleaned her gun, thought about it as she tried to sleep and couldn't, thought about it as dawn approached with the inevitability of judgment. And in the end, she came back to the same conclusion. She didn't know how to be anyone else. And changing now at this moment would dishonor everything Daniel had taught her, everything she'd built her life upon. So she stood before the mirror in her rented room and checked her gun one final time. Made sure every movement was smooth, every mechanism perfect. Tied her hair back so it wouldn't obscure her vision. Put on her coat despite the heat because it moved the way she needed it to move, because she'd practiced the draw from this coat 1,000 times. Then she walked downstairs and out into the street where Rattler Kane was waiting. Dawn painted red hollow in shades of gold and shadow, the sun just beginning its climb above the eastern hills. The main street was empty, except for two figures standing 50 yards apart. Sarah at one end, Kane at the other. The distance between them felt both infinite and impossibly small. No one watched. Or if they did, they watched from hiding from windows and cracks in doors, unwilling to witness directly what might happen next. Sarah understood. Death was private, should be private. The fact that it sometimes happened in public didn't make it a spectacle. Kane stood easy, relaxed, hand hanging loose near his gun. He looked like a man waiting for a friend, not preparing to kill. Sarah envied him that. She felt every muscle tense, every nerve screaming, her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape what was coming. "Last chance," Kane called across the distance. "Won't away. Live." Sarah's answer was to settle her stance, to let her hand fall near her holster, to show without words that this was happening, whether he wanted it to or not. Kane nodded. Respect maybe, or acceptance, or just acknowledgement that they'd reached the point where words were useless. The moment stretched, wind moved dust across empty street, a shutter creaked somewhere, a horse stamped in its stable. Normal sounds made surreal by context, by the knowledge that in seconds, someone would die. Then movement. A blur at the edge of Sarah's vision, a figure running from the Dust Falls saloon, small, fast, blonde hair flying. Grace. "Stop!" Grace's voice cut through the tension like brick-pane glass. "Nobody shoot!" She ran into the middle of the street, placing herself between Sarah and Kane, arms spread wide like she could physically block bullets with her body. Both adults froze, Sarah's hand halfway to her gun, Kane's fingers brushing his holster. "Grace, move." Sarah's voice was sharp with fear. "No, I won't. You want to shoot each other? You have to shoot through me first." Kane lowered his hand completely, stepping back. "Girl, this isn't your fight. She's all I have left. You take her and I'm alone. You both talk about principle and duty and doing what's right, but what about me, who protects me, who thinks about what I need?" Grace was crying now, words tumbling out in desperate rushes. "My mother died when I was born. My real father abandoned me. My adoptive father was murdered. Everyone I've ever loved leaves or dies or goes away, and I'm so tired of being alone." Sarah moved forward slowly, hands visible, no threat. "Grace, honey, I know you're scared." "I'm not scared. I'm angry. I'm furious that everyone keeps making choices that take them away from me. I'm sick of being brave. I'm exhausted from standing up and being strong and pretending I understand why death is better than compromise." She turned to Kane. "You have a daughter, 16 years old, in Denver. Would you want her watching her parent die for principle?" Kane's face had gone pale. "How did you know that?" "Because Marshall Hart told me. Because she knows what matters. She knows family matters more than reputation." She just forgot for a little while. The sun climbed higher. Light spilled across the street, illuminating the scene like a stage. Grace standing between two killers, arms spread, tears streaming, refusing to move. Sarah frozen between duty and love. Kane caught in the terrible realization that his presence here was asking someone to lose exactly what he was killing to provide for his own daughter. Then another figure appeared. Emma running from the saloon, face flushed. Riders coming from the east, a lot of them. Everyone turned. Dust rose on the horizon, getting closer. 10 riders, maybe 15, moving fast. Sarah squinted against the sun, trying to make out details. Then she saw the badge on the lead rider's chest catching morning light. Caleb Morgan, territorial marshal, coming with deputies and authority and the full weight of federal law. Sarah had sent for him days ago, a telegraph from the next town over, asking for backup, for support, for someone with more authority than a deputy marshal working alone. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone because she'd known people would ask why she didn't just wait for help instead of facing Kane alone. And the answer would have been that pride and principle in the ghost of Daniel Reed wouldn't let her wait, wouldn't let her be smart, would have driven her to face Kane even when backup was coming. But Grace had stopped her, had given her time for smart to catch up with pride, had maybe saved her life by refusing to let her throw it away. Kane saw the riders and understood immediately. He turned to Sarah, tipped his hat. "Looks like our appointment's been canceled. Can't say I'm disappointed." He glanced at Grace. "You're a brave girl. Stupid, but brave. Take care of your marshal. She needs someone to remind her she's mortal." He mounted his horse and rode out, heading south, away from the approaching lawmen, away from Red Hollow, away from a confrontation that had suddenly lost its purpose. Sarah watched him go, feeling relief and disappointment warring in her chest. Caleb Morgan reined in his horse in front of Sarah Dust, settling around them. He was 40 years old, weathered by sun, and experienced with eyes that had seen too much and believed too little. But he believed in law. That counted for something. "Got your telegraph 4 days ago," he said. "Took time to gather men, to get authorization, to do this right instead of fast." He dismounted. "Glad to see you're still alive." "So am I," Sarah admitted. She looked at Grace, who was still standing in the street, still crying, still trembling with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. Thanks to her. Caleb studied Grace with the assessing eye of someone who'd learned to value courage. "You must be Grace Reed, Daniel's daughter." "I am." "He'd be proud of you. Hell, I'm proud of you, and I don't even know you." Ben joined them, bringing news of Victor Stone's whereabouts. The mine owner had gone to ground, barricading himself in his office with armed men. He knew the marshals were coming, knew his empire was about to fall. But he wasn't going quietly. "We need to end this," Caleb said, "peacefully if possible. But it ends today. Sarah, you have the evidence. Testimonies, Pike's confession, proof of forgery, everything you need. Then let's finish what Daniel started." They moved through town like a tied federal authority, backed by local support by miners and shopkeepers and families who'd lived under Victor's thumb for too long. Red Hollow emerged from hiding, seeing hope in the badges and guns of men who'd come to restore law. Victor's office was fortified, but fear had made his men sloppy. They'd barricaded the front, but left the back vulnerable. Caleb's deputies went in fast and clean, overwhelming resistance before it could organize. Within minutes, it was over. Victor's men disarmed, Victor himself sitting at his desk, staring at nothing, looking older than his 52 years. "It's done, Victor," Sarah said, stepping into the office. "Over. You lost." "Did I?" Victor looked up, eyes hollow. "You think this changes anything? Think arresting me fixes Red Hollow. I'm not the disease. I'm the symptom. This town was dying when I got here. I just controlled how it died." "Maybe, but at least now it has a chance to decide its own fate." Caleb placed Victor Stone under arrest. "Read the charges," in a voice that carried authority and finality. Victor's 3 sons had fled town the night before, warned by someone inside the marshal's office. Cole Levi and Brute Stone were now wanted men, their faces on posters that would follow them across the territory. Without their father's money and power, they were just 3 thugs with nowhere to hide. Murder, fraud, extortion, conspiracy. A list long enough to ensure Victor would never see freedom again. Thomas Pike was arrested next, dragged from his house, confessing everything before anyone even asked. The dam had broken. The lies couldn't hold anymore. But victory felt hollow, felt incomplete. Because justice delayed was justice denied, and 2 years of suffering couldn't be erased by 1 day of righteousness. The dead stayed dead. The wounded stayed wounded. And Red Hollow had learned lessons about power and fear that couldn't be unlearned. Sarah stood in the cemetery that evening, sunsetting, casting long shadows across graves that included too many good people. She placed wildflowers on Daniel's marker, Grace beside her, both women silent with their thoughts. "What happens now?" Grace asked, finally. "Trial, conviction. Victor spends the rest of his life in prison." Sarah paused. "And we figure out how to rebuild. How to turn a town that forgot what justice looked like back into something worth believing in." "Will you stay, help rebuild?" The question hung between them. Sarah had responsibilities elsewhere. Cases waiting. Territory that needed marshaling. She'd told herself this was temporary. Get justice for Daniel, then move on. That's what she did. That's who she was. But Grace was looking at her with eyes that held hope and fear in equal measure. And Sarah realized she had a choice. Keep being who she'd always been, moving from town to town, never staying, never connecting, never being more than Daniel's legacy. Or stay, root herself, become something more than a badge and a gun. I don't know, she admitted. I've never stayed anywhere. Not since I left here 8 years ago. Maybe it's time to learn how. The words echoed Emma's from the night before. Maybe it was time. Maybe Sarah had spent enough years proving she was what Daniel trained her to be. Maybe now she could figure out who she was beyond that. Who she could be if she chose life over constant duty. Let me think about it, she said. They walked back to town together as stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Red Hollow was quiet but not silent. People were in the streets, talking, planning, beginning the slow work of reclaiming their home from fear. It would take time, would take effort, would require believing in themselves again. But it could be done. Sarah had seen it before, had helped other towns find their way back from darkness. The question was whether she'd stay long enough to see it through here, whether Red Hollow could become home instead of just another job. She didn't have the answer yet, but for the first time in 15 years, she was asking the question, and that felt like progress. The morning after Victor Stone's arrest brought a different kind of quiet to Red Hollow. Not the oppressive silence of fear, but the tentative hush of people waiting to see if hope was real or just another cruelty. Sarah stood in Daniel's office, now truly hers, watching dawn paint the street in shades of amber and gold. Caleb Morgan sat across from her, maps and documents spread between them, coffee growing cold in forgotten cups. "We have testimony," Caleb said, tapping one pile of papers. "We have witnesses willing to speak. We have Pike's written confession. But Victor's lawyers are already filing motions, claiming the confession was coerced, claiming witnesses are unreliable, claiming we don't have physical proof the documents are forged." Sarah pulled out the deed Emma had found, the one transferring the Iron Creek mine to Victor's name. This was supposedly signed by Daniel on March 15, 1881. His journal proves he was in Silver City that day. Couldn't have signed it. Victor's lawyers will argue Daniel could have signed it before leaving, could have authorized someone else to file it in his absence. Then we prove who actually signed it. Thomas Pike, who was trained by Daniel to forge his signature for routine paperwork. Sarah stood pacing to the window. Pike is our key. His testimony connects everything: the forgery, the theft, the systematic destruction of this town. But he's terrified. He'll recant the moment Victor's lawyers get to him, unless we give him something he wants more than he fears Victor. What does a coward want more than safety? Redemption, the chance to undo what he's done, to save his mother from the shame of having raised a criminal. Sarah turned back to Caleb. "Dorothy Pike is the one who brought us his confession. She loves her son despite what he is. We offer Thomas a deal, full testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence. Life in prison instead of hanging. His mother keeps her house, keeps her dignity, doesn't have to watch her son die." Caleb considered this, fingers drumming on Daniel's desk. "You think he'll take it?" "I think a man who wrote a suicide letter because guilt was eating him alive will jump at the chance to make things right." Sarah paused. "And I think his mother will convince him if he hesitates. She wants this town to heal. Wants her son to be more than Victor Stone's accomplice." They found Thomas Pike in the makeshift cell Caleb's deputies had established in the old town hall basement. He sat on a narrow cot, head in his hands, looking like a man who'd already been executed and was just waiting for his body to realize it. When Sarah entered, he looked up with eyes so full of despair, it was almost painful to meet them. "Mr. Pike, I'm going to offer you something I shouldn't, a chance you don't deserve." Sarah pulled a chair close to the cell bars. "Full confession, every detail of how you forged Daniel's signature, every document you created, every dollar Victor paid you. You testify to all of it, and we'll recommend life imprisonment instead of the gallows." Pike's laugh was bitter as ash. "Life in prison, that's your mercy. Compared to hanging, yes. Compared to what you deserve, also yes." Sarah's voice hardened. "You helped kill my uncle, helped steal from people who could barely afford to eat, helped build an empire of fear and suffering. The only reason I'm offering you anything at all is because your mother asked me to. Because she's a good woman who shouldn't have to watch her son die. My mother, Pike's voice cracked. Does she know everything I did? She knows. She's known for years, and she loves you anyway, which is more grace than you've earned. Sarah leaned forward. You want to do something for her, something that matters. Tell the truth. Let her see you be brave for once. Let her believe her son can be more than a coward who sold his soul for $5,000. The silence stretched. Outside, Red Hollow was waking. Shopkeepers opening doors, miners heading to work at a mine that would soon be returned to them. Normal sounds of life continuing, despite yesterday's drama. Pike listened to it all, tears running down his weathered face. What do you need to know? Sarah pulled out her notebook. Everything. Start at the beginning. Thomas Pike's testimony took 3 hours. Every detail spilled out in a rush like poison drawn from a wound. How Victor had approached him in 1880, right after being stripped of his badge. How Victor had offered money safety partnership in building something that would make them both rich. How Pike had been weak and desperate and tired of being poor. Daniel trained me to copy his signature, Pike said, voice hollow with shame. For routine documents when he was out of town. Letters to suppliers, receipts for expenses, nothing important, nothing that would hurt anyone. He trusted me completely, and I used that trust to forge the most important documents of his career. The mine transfer. That was the first major one. Dated it while Daniel was in Silver City so he'd have an alibi if anyone questioned it later. Made it look like he'd signed it before leaving. Filed it through channels that didn't require Daniel's physical presence. By the time anyone could have checked, it was already legal record. And the others, 13 more over the next 2 years. Property transfers, business sales, mining rights, all of them forged, all of them making Victor richer while making everyone else poorer. Pike looked at his hands like they belonged to someone else. I kept telling myself it was just paperwork, just documents, that nobody was being hurt directly. But people were hurt, were ruined, were killed when they tried to resist. Sarah wrote it all down, hand cramping from the speed mine, cataloging every detail for the trial to come. When Pike finally finished, she had enough to bury Victor Stone so deep no lawyer could dig him out. Caleb came in as she was closing her notebook. We need to move fast. Victor's lawyers are pushing for a preliminary hearing tomorrow, trying to get bail set, get him released before we can build our case. Let them push. We're ready. Sarah stood feeling the weight of evidence in her hands. Pike testifies tomorrow. We present the forged documents. We show the pattern. And we make sure everyone in that courtroom understands exactly what Victor Stone did to Red Hollow. The hearing was held in the town hall, hastily converted to serve as a courtroom. Every seat filled, standing room packed, people who'd been too scared to speak for years suddenly finding their voices, demanding to be present when justice finally showed its face. Judge Warren presided, a territorial judge with a reputation for fairness and a face that suggested he'd seen every type of human wickedness and was surprised by none of it. Victor Stone sat at the defense table, flanked by 2 lawyers from Albuquerque, expensive suits and confident smiles suggesting they thought this was just another case they could win through legal maneuvering. Victor himself looked diminished somehow. The power that had made him seem larger than life had drained away, leaving just a man in his 50s, tired and defeated and trying not to show it. Grace sat in the front row, Emily Stone beside her. The 2 half-sisters had met the night before, brought together by Emma's quiet diplomacy. They'd talked for hours, finding common ground and shared abandonment in being daughters of a man who'd chosen everything except them. Now they sat together, united, waiting to see their father face consequences for the first time in his life. Judge Warren called the court to order. We're here for a preliminary hearing in the matter of Territory versus Victor Stone. Multiple charges, including murder, fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. Mr. Stone's counsel has requested bail be set. The prosecution opposes. Marshal Morgan, you may present your argument. Caleb stood, papers in hand. Your Honor, the defendant is a flight risk with substantial financial resources and motive to flee. He's also demonstrated a pattern of witness intimidation and violence against those who oppose him. Granting bail would endanger the community and compromise the integrity of this case. Marcus Webb, Victor's lead attorney, rose smoothly. Your Honor, my client is a respected businessman with deep ties to this community. He's never been convicted of any crime. The allegations against him are based entirely on hearsay and the dubious testimony of admitted criminals seeking to reduce their own sentences. Denying bail would be a gross miscarriage of justice. I have testimony, Caleb said. Multiple witnesses, physical evidence, and a written confession from Thomas Pike, Mr. Stone's accomplice, detailing exactly how they systematically defrauded this town. A confession from a man facing the gallows who will say anything to save his neck. A confession corroborated by documents, by witnesses, by a pattern of criminal behavior spanning 5 years. Caleb's voice hardened. And by the death of Marshal Daniel Reed, who was investigating these very crimes when he was murdered. Webb's smile didn't waver. There's no evidence connecting my client to Marshal Reed's death. The official investigation concluded it was a burglary gone wrong. Person or persons unknown. Case closed. Sarah stood. She hadn't planned to speak. Wasn't technically part of the prosecution. But something in Webb's casual dismissal of Daniel's murder lit a fire in her chest that couldn't be contained. "May I address the court, Your Honor?" Judge Warren looked at her over his spectacles. "You are Deputy Marshal Sarah Hart, Daniel Reed's niece. I've been investigating his death and the corruption in Red Hollow for the past 2 weeks. And you have something to add to this hearing. I have a letter, written by Daniel Reed the night he died, hidden in his office, found by me 2 days ago." Sarah pulled the folded paper from her coat hands steady despite the emotion threatening to choke her voice. In it, he states clearly who killed him and why. The courtroom erupted. Judge Warren's gavel cracked like thunder. "Order Marshal Hart approach the bench." Sarah walked forward, letter in hand, aware of every eye on her. Victor's face had gone pale. His lawyers were whispering urgently. Grace was crying silently, Emma's arm around her shoulders. Sarah handed the letter to Judge Warren, who read it with the careful attention of someone who understood its significance. "This is authenticated, verified as Daniel Reed's handwriting. It is, Your Honor. I've had experts examine it. The paper, the ink, the handwriting, all consistent with documents known to be written by Daniel in the days before his death." Judge Warren read aloud, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "If you're reading this, I'm dead. Victor Stone killed me. Not with his own hands, perhaps, but with his choices, his greed, his willingness to destroy anyone who threatened his empire. The mind transfer is forged. Thomas Pike created it using skills I taught him, not knowing he'd use them to steal everything I tried to protect. The deaths are not accidents. They're murders. Calculated, planned, executed by a man who was once my brother and became my executioner. Don't let my silence make them victories. Find the truth. Restore what was stolen. And tell Grace her father loved her more than life itself." The silence that followed was profound. Even the lawyers had nothing to say. Victor sat frozen, staring at nothing, watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. Then he stood, slowly, like a man carrying impossible weight. His lawyers grabbed at his arms, whispering urgent warnings, but he shook them off. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I need to say something. Mr. Stone, I strongly advise against any statement at this time." Webb's professional composure was cracking. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." "I know." Victor looked at Judge Warren. "But I need to say it anyway, because I'm tired. Tired of lying, tired of pretending, tired of being the man I became instead of the man I wanted to be." Judge Warren studied him. "Mr. Stone, you understand, you're under oath, that this is being recorded?" "I understand, and I don't care anymore." Victor turned to face the courtroom, facing Grace and Emily in the front row. "I killed Daniel Reed, not directly. I didn't pull the trigger myself, but I might as well have, because I created the situation that made his death necessary, made it inevitable." His lawyers were on their feet, objecting, trying to stop him. But Victor kept talking, words spilling out after years of being damned behind pride and fear and the terrible weight of maintaining lies. "Daniel and I were partners for 15 years, brothers in everything but blood. We wore the badge together, saved each other's lives, built Red Hollow into something good and decent. Then my daughter got sick. Emily. My beautiful girl dying of something doctors in Red Hollow couldn't fix. I needed money I didn't have. Money I'd never have on a marshal's salary." Emily was crying now. Grace held her hand, both girls watching their father confess to crimes that had destroyed so many lives. I started taking protection money, just a little at first, told myself it was temporary, just until Emily was safe. Daniel found out, told me to stop, said I was betraying everything we'd stood for. I didn't listen, couldn't listen, because my daughter's life mattered more than principles, more than oaths, more than anything. So you lost your badge, Judge Warren said quietly. I lost everything that mattered except the money. Used it to save Emily. Brought her back from the edge of death. Then I looked at what I'd done, what I'd become, and I couldn't stop. Couldn't go back, because going back would mean admitting I'd destroyed my life for nothing. Easier to keep going or forward. To tell myself that being rich justified the cost. Victor's voice broke. Daniel tried to save me. Tried to bring me back. Said it wasn't too late, that we could fix things together. I went to him that night planning to confess, planning to turn myself in, accept whatever punishment came. But then he said Grace would know the truth, that she'd know her father had abandoned her and chosen money over his own child. And I couldn't let that happen. Couldn't let her know how weak I was. So you shot him. I shot the only person who ever believed I could be better than I was. Shot him and watched him die and told myself it was necessary. Told myself it was his fault for not understanding what I had to do. Victor looked at his daughters. But it wasn't necessary. It was cowardice. And Daniel died because I couldn't face what I'd become. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. A confession, complete, unforced. Given not because Victor had to, but because carrying the lie had finally become heavier than bearing the truth. Judge Warren let the moment stretch, understanding that some things needed to settle into people's bones before proceeding. Mr. Stone, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you kill Daniel Reed? Yes. Did you orchestrate a systematic campaign of fraud and extortion against the people of Red Hollow? Yes. Did you arrange the deaths of witnesses who threatened to expose your crimes? Not directly, but I created the conditions where those deaths became inevitable. So yes, I'm responsible. Judge Warren looked at the lawyers who sat defeated, knowing their case had just evaporated. Bail is denied. Mr. Stone will be remanded to custody pending trial, which, given this confession, should proceed quickly. He looked at Victor with something that might have been pity. You'll have the opportunity to recant this statement, to claim duress or temporary insanity or any number of legal defenses, but I suspect you won't. No, Your Honor, I won't. I'm done lying. They led Victor away in chains. He paused when passing Grace and Emily tried to speak, but words failed him. What could he say? What apology could cover the magnitude of his failures as a father, as a man, as a member of the human community? Grace looked at him with eyes that held neither forgiveness nor hatred, just a terrible sadness for what might have been if he'd chosen differently. Outside the courthouse, the town gathered in clusters processing what they'd witnessed. A confession. Justice. The end of years of fear. But the emotion wasn't celebration. It was something more complex. Relief mixed with grief. Victory tainted by the cost of achieving it. Red Hollow had won, but the winning felt hollow because it came too late to save the people already lost. Sarah found Ben in the crowd, his face showing the same complex mixture of emotions. It's over, he said, not a question, a statement of fact that felt unreal despite its truth. The trial will still happen. The other charges need to be addressed. But yes, the main fight is over. So what happens now? Sarah looked at Red Hollow spreading out before her, a town that had learned to live with corruption and now had to learn to live without it. People who'd forgotten how to stand up for themselves and now had to remember. A community that needed rebuilding from the foundation up. Now comes the hard part, making sure what we won actually means something. The trial lasted 3 days, not because the evidence was complicated or the defense had any real arguments, but because justice required due process even when guilt was obvious. Thomas Pike testified for 6 hours detailing every forgery, every false document, every theft disguised as legitimate business. Witnesses paraded through each one, adding another piece to the mosaic of Victor Stone's crimes. The verdict was never in doubt, guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing came next, and it was there that the true complexity of justice revealed itself. Judge Warren listened to arguments from both sides. Heard about Victor's daughter, about his desperation, about the impossible choice between law and love. Heard about the lives he'd destroyed, the town he'd corrupted, the man he'd murdered. Weighed it all in scales that could never truly balance. Victor Stone, you're guilty of crimes that warrant death. Multiple murders, systematic fraud, corruption of public office. By every measure of law and justice, you should hang. Judge Warren paused, looking at Grace and Emily sitting together in the front row. But your daughters have asked this court for mercy, not because you deserve it, but because they believe justice should be tempered with compassion, even for those who showed no compassion themselves. Victor stood to hear his sentence, hands shaking, face showing every one of his 52 years and then some. I'm sentencing you to life imprisonment at hard labor. You'll work every day until you've repaid every dollar you stole. Given the amount that will take the rest of your natural life, you'll never be free, never taste anything but the consequences of your choices. But you'll live. And perhaps in that life, you'll find some small measure of redemption. Victor accepted the sentence without complaint. What could he say that it was too harsh, too lenient? He'd killed his best friend and destroyed a town. Any punishment that left him breathing was more mercy than he'd shown others. After the sentencing, Grace and Emily approached Sarah in the courthouse hallway. Both young women had been crying, but they stood straight, dignified, refusing to let grief bend them. Grace spoke first. Marshal Hart, we wanted to thank you for giving us back our town, for making sure our father faced consequences, for everything. You don't need to thank me. I was just finishing what Daniel started. Emily stepped forward, shy, uncertain. I know I don't have the right to ask anything, but could you tell me about him, about Daniel? About what kind of father he was to Grace? Sarah looked at the two sisters, both daughters of Victor Stone, both abandoned by him in different ways, both trying to make sense of a father who'd chosen everything except them. And she made a decision. He was patient, kind, strict when necessary, but never cruel. He taught Grace to read by reading to her every night, taught her to shoot by making it about precision and respect for the weapon, not about violence. Taught her that being strong didn't mean being hard, that courage was choosing right even when right was difficult. Sarah's voice softened. He loved her completely, without reservation, without conditions, the way a father should. Emily absorbed this, tears spilling down her cheeks. I wish I'd known him, known what it was like to have a father who stayed. Maybe you still can, Grace said quietly. Maybe we can know each other, be family, not because of blood or fathers or any of that, just because we choose to. The two young women embraced, finding comfort in shared loss, beginning something new from the wreckage of everything old. Sarah watched them and felt something shift in her chest. This was legacy, not badges or guns or trials, but people choosing connection over isolation, choosing to build instead of destroy. Later that evening, Caleb found Sarah in Daniel's office, packing evidence, preparing reports, doing the bureaucratic work that followed every case. He sat without invitation, looking tired but satisfied. Territorial governor wants to recognize you. Official commendation. Maybe even a promotion. He paused. You could make full marshal, have authority across the whole territory. It's what Daniel would have wanted for you. Sarah touched the deputy badge on her chest, feeling its familiar weight. Can I ask you something about Daniel, about the night he sent me his badge? What about it? Did he send the paperwork to make me an official federal marshal, or did he just send the badge and hope I'd understand what he wanted? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he sighed. You know, don't you? I suspected, confirmed it when I checked the official records. Daniel sent me his badge 2 weeks before he died. There's no paperwork authorizing me as his replacement, no official transfer of authority. I've been acting as a federal marshal for 2 weeks without actually being one. Technically, everything you've done could be challenged. Every arrest, every piece of evidence, all of it gathered by someone without proper authority. Which is why you came with deputies. Why you made sure everything we did was witnessed by someone with unquestionable credentials. Sarah smiled slightly. You've been covering for me this whole time. Daniel was my friend too. When he died, I knew something was wrong. Knew the investigation was a sham, but I didn't have cause to intervene, didn't have jurisdiction. Caleb pulled a small box from his coat. Then you showed up. wearing his badge, acting on his legacy, giving me the excuse I needed to come here and finish what he started. He opened the box. Inside lay a new badge, silver and gleaming. Federal Marshal, official authorization from the territorial governor. All the legal standings Sarah had been lacking. This is yours if you want it. Full authority, full backing, the job Daniel trained you for. Sarah stared at this badge, feeling the weight of choice pressing down. This was everything she'd worked toward for 15 years. The culmination of Daniel's training, proof she'd become what he'd believed she could be. But taking it meant leaving Red Hollow, meant continuing the life of moving from place to place, never staying, never being more than a badge and a gun. Can I think about it? Take all the time you need. The territory isn't going anywhere. That night, Sarah walked through Red Hollow alone, watching the town settle into darkness. Lights burned in windows. Voices carried on the evening air. Normal sounds of normal life in a place learning to be normal again. She found herself at the cemetery, standing before Daniel's grave, moonlight painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. "I don't know what to do," she said to the stone marker. "You trained me to be a marshal, to move where I'm needed, to never settle. But Grace needs me. Red Hollow needs me. And I'm starting to think maybe I need them too." The grave offered no answers. Dead men rarely did. But standing there surrounded by the quiet of the cemetery and the distant sounds of a town healing, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace, the sense that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what mattered. "I'll make you proud," she said finally. "Whatever I choose, I promise you that." She turned to leave and found Grace standing at the cemetery gate, silhouetted against the town lights. The girl had followed her, quiet as a ghost, respecting her need for solitude, but unable to stay completely away. "You're thinking about leaving," Grace said. "Not a question. I'm thinking about what comes next, what I'm supposed to do now that Victor's in prison and justice is served. And you think the answer is to move on to the next town that needs saving." Sarah moved closer, standing before this girl who'd become more than a witness or a victim or a case to be solved. "I think that's what I know how to do, what I've always done. Daniel knew how to do that too, but he chose to stay, chose Red Hollow over everything else, chose me." Grace's voice broke slightly. "I'm not asking you to replace him. Nobody could. But I'm asking you to consider that maybe staying is braver than leaving, that maybe building something is harder than just fixing what's broken and moving on." The words hit deep because they were true. Sarah had spent 15 years avoiding attachment, avoiding connections that could become obligations. She told herself it was about serving the greater good, about going where she was needed most. But maybe it was also about fear. Fear of being vulnerable, fear of failing the people she cared about. Fear of being Daniel and dying for principles while the people who loved her grieved. "If I stay, I can't promise I'll be good at it. I don't know how to be anything but a marshal." "Then learn the same way you learned everything else, one day at a time, one choice at a time." Grace stepped closer, moonlight catching tears on her cheeks. "I've lost everyone. My mother, my blood father, Daniel. I'm not asking you to be my parent or my guardian or anything official. I'm just asking you to be here, to let me know what it's like to have someone who doesn't leave." Sarah pulled Grace into an embrace, feeling the girl shake with suppressed ums, feeling her own eyes burn with tears she'd been holding back for weeks. They stood together in the cemetery, surrounded by the dead, choosing life, choosing connection, choosing to build something from the ruins of everything that had been destroyed. "I'll stay," Sarah whispered. "At least for a while, at least until you don't need me anymore. I'll always need you. Then I guess I'm staying." 3 months passed. Red Hollow transformed slowly, the way towns do when healing from deep wounds. The mine was restructured, ownership transferred to a workers' cooperative that split profits fairly. The protection fees ended. The corrupt officials were replaced through actual elections where people voted without fear of consequences. The town council met weekly, making decisions in public, accountable to the people they served. Ben Tucker became town marshal, wearing his badge with the nervous pride of someone still getting used to authority. He wasn't perfect, made mistakes, but he made them honestly, corrected them when he could, and learned from them when he couldn't. The town trusted him because he was one of them, because he'd stood up when standing up mattered, because he wore the badge not for power but for service. Grace expanded her education working with Emma in the mornings, studying with a retired teacher in the afternoons, planning to attend normal school in Denver the following year. She wanted to be a teacher to give other children the gift of knowledge that Daniel had given her. Emily visited often, the two sisters building a relationship based not on shared blood, but on shared survival, on understanding what it meant to be abandoned by the same man in different ways. Sarah found herself settling into Red Hollow in ways she'd never expected. She kept the deputy badge, kept the authority to investigate crimes across the territory, but used it less and less. There was work here, enough work to keep her busy without constantly traveling. And there were people here, people who mattered, people who'd become something more than cases or witnesses or victims needing rescue. She trained Ben and three other deputies in proper law enforcement, taught them what Daniel had taught her: how to read a situation before it turned violent, how to de-escalate when possible, how to use force when necessary but never more than necessary, how to be the kind of lawman people trusted rather than feared. And slowly, carefully, she let herself become part of Red Hollow's fabric. Not just the marshal who'd saved them, but Sarah, the woman who played chess with Henry at the saloon, who helped Emma with inventory, who taught Grace to shoot with the same patience Daniel had shown teaching her, who attended town meetings and church services and social gatherings, not because duty required it, but because she wanted to. One evening, 6 months after Victor's sentencing, a writer arrived with a letter from Caleb Morgan. Sarah read it on the porch of the small house she'd rented on the edge of town, watching sunset paint the desert in impossible colors. The letter was brief. Another town needed help. Copper Ridge, north of Red Hollow, suffering under a similar pattern of corruption and fear. The territorial governor was requesting Sarah specifically, offering her the full marshal's badge if she'd take the assignment. Sarah sat with the letter for a long time, feeling the pull of duty, of the life she'd known, of the work she was trained to do. It would be easy to say yes, to mount up and ride north and do what she did best, fix what was broken and move on before the fixing got complicated. But then Grace appeared, returning from her studies, face flushed with excitement about something she'd learned. And Emma called from the street, asking if Sarah wanted to join them for dinner. And Ben rode past, tipping his hat, heading home to his own family, secure in the knowledge that Red Hollow had people watching over it who cared about more than just the law. Sarah folded the letter and went inside. She'd write back to Caleb tomorrow. Recommend someone else for Copper Ridge. Someone younger. Someone still learning to balance duty with life. Someone who needed the experience she'd already earned. Tonight she was needed here. For dinner with people who'd become family. For chess games and conversations and the quiet joy of being somewhere she belonged. The letter could wait. Copper Ridge could wait. For the first time in 15 years, Sarah Hart was exactly where she wanted to be. And that felt like enough. 1 year after Victor Stone's sentencing, Red Hollow held its first annual festival. Not celebrating what had happened, but marking survival resilience, the choice to keep going despite everything. The main street filled with people, music, food, laughter that sounded genuine rather than desperate. Sarah stood on Daniel's grave now, properly maintained, flowers fresh, the stone polished. She'd come early before the crowds, wanting a moment alone with the man who'd shaped her life more than anyone except her parents. You'd be proud of what's happening here, she said quietly. Grace is thriving. Ben's becoming the marshal you hoped he'd be. The town is healing. Not perfect, not fixed, but better, moving in the right direction. She pulled out the deputy badge, Daniel's badge, and placed it on the grave marker. Next to it, she set a new badge. The Federal Marshal's Commission. Caleb had eventually convinced her to accept, not as a replacement for being part of Red Hollow, but as an addition to it. Authority when needed, service when required, but rooted here in this place with these people. I'm staying, she continued, not because I have to, because I choose to. You taught me that duty matters, but you also taught me by example that sometimes duty is staying when leaving would be easier. Building when destroying would be simpler. Loving when loving makes you vulnerable. Footsteps approached behind her. Grace, now 17, taller, more confident, carrying herself with the poise of someone who'd survived tragedy and found strength in it. She placed her own flowers on Daniel's grave, stood beside Sarah in comfortable silence. You know what I remember most about him? Grace said finally. Not the big things, not the dramatic moments, just he was always there, every morning, every evening, present, paying attention, making me feel like I mattered more than anything else in the world. That's what made him a good father, not the title, the showing up. You show up too, every day, for me, for Red Hollow, for everyone who needs you. Grace looked at Sarah. That's what makes you family. Not blood, not duty, just the choice to keep showing up. They stood together as the sun climbed higher, as the town woke fully, as the festival preparations reached their conclusion. In a few hours, Red Hollow would celebrate, would dance and eat, and temporarily forget the pain of the past years, would choose joy despite everything. But for now, in this quiet moment, two women stood before a grave, honoring a man who'd taught them both that legacy isn't what you accomplish. It's what you inspire others to become. It's the ripples that continue long after the stone has sunk beneath the surface. It's the choice to be better than circumstance suggests possible. Sarah took Grace's hand. Together they walked back toward town, toward the festival, toward the future they were building one choice at a time. Behind them, Daniel Reed's grave stood quiet in the morning sun, marked by two badges that represented two different kinds of service, two different ways of honoring the same commitment to justice and mercy, and the stubborn belief that people, even broken people in broken places, deserve better. Red Hollow spread before them, imperfect and healing and alive. Sarah felt the deputy badge heavy on her chest, felt the weight of responsibility and choice and commitment. But she also felt something lighter. Hope, purpose, the knowledge that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what mattered. The festival began. Music filled the air, children laughed, adults relaxed for the first time in years. And in the cemetery on the edge of town, a breeze moved across Daniel Reed's grave, stirring the flowers Grace had placed, catching the badges that gleamed in afternoon light. Justice had been served. Corruption had been defeated. But more importantly, a town had learned to hope again. A community had learned to stand together. And one woman had learned that staying could be braver than leaving, that building could be harder than fighting, that legacy was measured not in victories, but in the lives you chose to touch, the people you chose to love, the places you chose to call home. Sarah Hart had found hers, and she was staying.